Okay, welcome everybody. Glad to have everybody learning on this Tuesday night. I'm Rabbi Kavod Weider, and this class is World of Jewish Texts. And this is going to be was a real challenge to put this class together. For those of you who took the Jewish history class with me, one-on-one 101 in the spring, you know that was, in 2 hours trying to cram all of Jewish history into 2 hours. What do you choose? What do you highlight? What do how much time? And so this is kind of like that same challenge, which is that Jewish text is a sea of Jewish texts. And really this evening is about is trying to give a bit of an overview of kind of the major classical texts throughout Jewish history, and a little bit about understanding how they've impacted Jewish tradition, the Jewish people, and how we can understand more of what Judaism looks like today, as informed by these texts. So, all right. So what I want to just start out with, and I'm gonna share my screen in a moment. Let's find it here. Start with a famous piece of the Talmud that I think says exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about Jewish texts. Let me make it bigger. So if you look at this piece from Shabbat, this is a famous midrash. It talks about an incident. There was another incident involving one Gentile who came before Shammai. Shammai was one of the great teachers and head of a whole group of students and disciples. And this Gentile said to Shammai, "Convert me on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot." Okay, so it's almost like saying, I want to join the Jewish people. I want to be a part of this, but I want the Cliff Notes version. I want you to, give it to me in a sound bite, while you're on one foot. And of course, what's the response of Shammai? He pushes him away with a builder's cubit in his hand, which is a big stick, hits him with a stick, says, "Get out of here." This was a common measuring stick, and Shammai was a builder by trade. So the same Gentile comes before Hillel, and Hillel converted him. And he said to him, "You want to know what it is, what the Torah is on one foot? That which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That's the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation. Go study." And this is a beautiful little piece, and there's a couple of things in here, which is to say, in some sense, there is an essence of the Torah. There is an essence of the teaching. And the essence really has to do in some way with our own common humanity, our own sense of being in the divine image, each one of us, which is, what's hateful to you, don't do to somebody else. Really, don't think that somebody else is separate from you, that it won't have an effect. But what we know is that living that, being able to really treat people with deep respect and understanding and wisdom and compassion, is a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing because we're imperfect people. And so the rest of the Torah is its interpretation. How do you live this way of being in the world, given our imperfection of being human? And then what Hillel says, and this is the key: go study. Go study. You wanna learn the Torah? Go study. And what that study is really about is, it can't just be about a gathering of information. Because if all we're talking about is the information, is the interpretation of this one verse, how much can you actually say about it information-wise? It has to be something else. There has to be some way that we really engage with our own common humanity. And that's an endless process. And it's an endless process by which we study. And so what, we know, and you've probably heard that Jewish people are called the people of the book, right? The people of the book. And we're called the people of the book because of this fundamental piece, interpretation and study. So the kind of overview that I want us to look at is this little kind of inverted pyramid when we think about Jewish texts and classical Jewish texts. And the core of it at its very bottom is the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. And we'll explore a little bit what we mean by the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible is not exactly the Old Testament. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, about what's the difference between the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. But really, the Bible itself is the core. All of Jewish text flows out of the Bible. And it flows to the next kind of level, which we're going to go through all of these. I'm just giving an overview, which from about 100 to 600 CE is Talmud, Midrash, rabbinic texts. And it's really what the Hebrew Bible means to Judaism is really filtered primarily through this level of Jewish text, this period of about 500 years that we call Talmud and Midrash. And then we have another historical level, which is, the medieval times. And this is law codes, where we start to learn about Jewish law and halakha in a new way than we ever did before. And there's a huge development of poetry, which is part of sacred Jewish texts, Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and philosophy, philosophical works are introduced onto the Jewish scene during this period of time. And the other piece that we'll explore today, I didn't put it in my diagram, is medieval Bible commentaries. That there have always been interpretations of Bible from the Talmud and Midrashic time, but there is kind of a new level and a new way of relating to Bible and to Torah through some of the great medieval commentators, which also were that period. And then we come into 1700 through 1900, and I put here mainly Chassidut, this great birth of Hasidism, which is another development of Jewish mysticism. But I also should probably add things like the period of the Haskalah, or the Enlightenment, and some of the more rational writings of Spinoza and Montefiore. And then we have what's probably the 20th century to the present, which we can talk about modern Jewish writings, poetry, all of those things. So that's kind of the overview. Is there any, before we kind of launch into the Bible, any questions? You can just unmute yourself and ask any questions about kind of this overview. Is there something here that I'm leaving out? I probably am. Let me know. Okay, are we good? Oh, let's see. I just saw this text here. Yes, I will. Let me take a moment before we go on, and I will send this document, the link to this document, because it is a Google document, in the chat. Hold on one second. Okay, document is now in the chat. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the bottom of the pyramid, the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible. Now, the Hebrew Bible is called the Tanakh because of these three, it's an acronym for the three sections of the Bible: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which the person here in this graphic translated as law, but I would say that that's not actually accurate. Torah is more accurate to mean teaching. So Torah means teaching, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writing. And you see here, of course, the Torah that we know that is in the scroll that we take out to read every Shabbat is composed of the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's also there's Hebrew terms for each of these 5, which I regret is not on here: Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. And that's one section of the Bible. But there also is Nevi'im, which are the prophets. And here there's former prophets, latter prophets, and you see these different Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. There's also called the 12 other prophets, people like Haggai and Micah and Jonah, and others that make up those 12, but those are in the Bible also, Book of Prophets. And then we have Ketuvim, which is the writings. And in the writings, there is the Psalms, again, kind of poetry, songs attributed to King David, but we know probably from later scholarship that it was probably written by others. Proverbs, which in Hebrew is Mishlei, which is wisdom tradition and literature, and the book of Job. And then we have also the 5 Megillot, or scrolls, and these are read during each of the holidays. There's the Song of Songs, the love story song, which is read on the Shabbat of Passover. There's Ruth, the book of Ruth, which is written on Shavuot. Lamentations, or Echa, written on Tisha B'Av, which is from the book of Jeremiah. Ecclesiastes, to everything turn, there is a season, and that's written during the holiday of Sukkot, read during the holiday of Sukkot. And of course, the book of Esther, which is on the holiday of Purim. And then we have some different books: the book of Daniel, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and Chronicles, or Divrei Hayamim, other kind of versions of the Book of Kings and other events that has happened. So these are the 3 sacred books of the Bible. Now, there's a whole bunch of, let's see. At the time of, let's say, what did I give you here? From about 500 BCE to 100, maybe 800 BCE to 100, there were a lot of sacred books that were around at that time. Lots of books that people considered holy. And it wasn't until the Pharisees, or what are called the rabbis of 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, that really decided what's in and what's out, what is going to be part of the Jewish canon. Because there were a lot of different sacred books that are not included here. And those are books like the Book of Maccabees, which we know tells a lot of the story of Hanukkah, not in the Hebrew Bible. There were things like the Book of Judith, or other different books which are called Apocrypha. And Apocrypha are sacred works that didn't make it into the Bible for whatever the reason. And there's interesting discussions in the Talmud about what makes it in, what doesn't, over and why. But there was a lot of different things that went into it, probably from political things to other more ideological reasons of what made it in and what made it out, didn't make it in. But what you'll find is in a Christian Bible, like the King James Version or others, you'll find now that there's the Old Testament and the New Testament in the Christian Bible. The New Testament is the gospel and the teachings of Jesus. But the Old Testament has all of what the books that you see here are, except it also has many of the books that we know as the Apocrypha that weren't included here, but that you will find in what the Christian Bible considers the Old Testament. So that's a little bit of the difference. We haven't really gone into translation yet, um, but that has everything to do with how the Bible was translated, plays into the differences also between the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. Before we keep moving on, any questions so far or comments?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Alex is Maury. So how do we know what was written when? How do we know that?
You know, there is some literature about it. For the most part, they don't have any kind of definitive period. Out of all of these different books that you see here, there are different time periods that are connected to different books. So all of these things did not, this wasn't one book that suddenly was written at one time. It was a lot of individual books at different times that, but I think what you can, a lot of kind of common scholarship has looked at and seen that there has been texts that have been connected back to various books in the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that go back to even 800, 700 BCE. You know, different books of the prophets, you know, when they actually became something that was written down. There's usually a lot of debate about those different things. So we don't really have exact dates, just kind of time periods of when it was likely that these books appeared on the scene when things were found, whether those were findings in the Dead Sea Scrolls or other major archaeological findings.
So somewhat tied to archaeological findings.
That's how we know, yes, how carbon dating, finding different books, seeing how things are used. That's a whole field of biblical scholarship and criticism that looks at, you know, at Bible as not really just necessarily literature or not necessarily as religious texts, but as historical documents.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Question, Rabbi.
Yeah.
So I have been engaged. Well, basically, when you hear the debate about Old Testament Hebrew scriptures within Christian circles, a question that has been brought up recently from a group that I know, the question is, would the Old Testament use and inclusion of the Hebrew Bible be considered cultural appropriation? You know, what are your thoughts on that?
So the question is, you're saying is including Old Testament within the Christian Bible cultural appropriation?
Well, is including the Hebrew scriptures within Christian tradition in the form of Old Testament considered cultural appropriation?
I mean, you know, we're gonna no, I wouldn't say that at all. And I want to come back to that question a little bit when we start exploring Midrash,
Okay.
because I think it's absolutely 100% appropriate for Christian, you know, both Christianity and Islam are both have
Yeah. Yeah.
the Hebrew Bible as really, you know, as Hebrew scriptures as kind of a foundation for their different traditions. And a lot of it is how is it used and interpreted and what has developed out of it. And I think what's more important is being able to, I think what's more relevant is being able to use Hebrew scripture appropriately as being an expression of Christianity, let's say, as opposed to calling it a version of Judaism. And I'm saying this specifically within Messianic or
Yes.
for Jesus circles, where there's a sense of saying that what we're practicing is, because we go back to the practices and the teachings of the Torah, that what we're doing is practicing Judaism. But Judaism is so much more than just what's in the Torah itself. It's how the rabbis, the first, second century, third century, interpreted the Torah. And a lot of that really flies in the face of what's developed into Christian tradition. So it has absolute integrity for Christians to be able to use Hebrew scripture as meaningful sacred texts within the context of Christianity. But to call it Judaism would not have integrity.
Okay.
And let's come back to that, because I think as we move
Yes.
forward, it'll become more clear.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Now, before we move on here with a little bit more with Bible and then the next level, I just want to talk a little bit about Jewish texts in general. That the Torah, or what we say the Bible, is considered to have been revealed at Mount Sinai, as we know in the story of Exodus. This story of incredible Moses, Moses goes up the mountain, the people are at the foot of the mountain, and God reveals God's self in that moment. And of course, we get the 10 Commandments. But the tradition really is that the entire Torah, the entire 5 books of Moses, the entire 5 books of Moses are revealed to Moses in that moment at Mount Sinai, as the tradition holds it. And this is called written Torah. And Moses, even though he doesn't write down everything that was in there, writes down the 10 Commandments, brings down the tablets, Moses spends the rest of the time teaching the Israelites everything that was revealed. And that is what we have as the written Torah. Now, the tradition also goes ahead and says that everything we saw on that pyramid, that upside down pyramid, beyond the Bible, is considered Torah Sheba'al Peh, or oral Torah. That all of that, as the tradition has it, was revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai. Everything, the teachings of the rabbis in the first century, the philosophy, the Kabbalah in medieval times, all the way up to our present day, was revealed to Mount Sinai. And in fact, any of the new interpretations that each one of us come up with from Torah, that if those interpretations bring us closer to God and bring our community closer, one could say that that was also revealed at Mount Sinai. And our new interpretation is just a rediscovery of the original revelation that was already there. So this tradition really is holding that our sacred texts have incredible sanctity, that regardless of whether we know, of course, that it's written down by human beings, but there is a sense that all of these texts have, even though they take place within their particular cultural context, they have great inspiration and sanctity. They were originally revealed at Sinai. So the act of engaging with Jewish sacred text is something that we don't just engage as readers, but we engage with as interactive wrestlers. In fact, even the word Israel, or the people Israel, B'nai Yisrael, the word Yisrael means one who wrestles with God, one who wrestles with God. So being part of the people of Israel means to be a God wrestler. It means to not just read sacred texts and just accept things on a fundamentalist or literalist level, but instead it means to wrestle with it, to dialogue with it, to discuss it, and to not only do that in our own minds, but to do that with each other. The traditional way of studying Torah is done in chevruta, in pairs. And we'll have to save it for a future. I really debated in putting this class together because so much is, besides talking about the sacred texts, I also wanted to give you an experience of wrestling with some of the sacred texts. And to do that in chevruta, with each other. The problem is there's no way that we would have been able to cover the breadth of what we're doing if we delve deeply into any particular text or historical period. So I opted, for better for worse, for this to be a bit of a survey session. But what I want to really say is that the way that sacred texts are meant to be engaged with is they're meant to be wrestled with. And we'll talk more about Talmud in just a little bit, but my whole rabbinic school training was, out of the 6 years, 4 out of the 6 years of my training was 3 days a week, having 3 hours in the Beit Midrash, which is the house of study, with my study partner sitting in front of me, and studying Talmud, wrestling with Talmud, discussing it, going back and forth. It's not something to be just read as an individual and reflected on. It's something to read and then discuss and argue with and move back and forth. And that mode of study was part of my 3 days a week, 4 out of 6 years of doing that, because it was a lot about learning how to think. And it was a lot about learning that the experience of study is one that happens in community. And this is what's a really core piece of what Jewish text means in the place of Judaism. So not only is it a way that we wrestle with it in community, but the texts really shape how we live our Jewish lives. The entire liturgical structure of the Jewish year, with Shabbat and sacred festivals, times, life cycles, all of these things resound with the echoes of these texts. In our prayer book, which we can engage with daily, morning, afternoon, evening, or on Shabbat as part of the weekly, our weekly day of rest, or whether it has to do with festivals of celebration of Passover, Sukkot, you'll find in the prayer book quotations and allusions to the Bible, Talmudic sources, poems from the Middle Ages, rituals of Kabbalah, of our mystical tradition, and even the philosophy of Maimonides is all within our prayer book. So it draws on all these different places. That's part of kind of the rhythm of living Jewish life. Every Shabbat, we read from the Torah and the prophets, from those 2 sections that we just looked at. On the festivals, we looked at that we read the Megillot, the book of Ruth and Esther and Ecclesiastes and so on. On Passover, we read the Haggadah, this sacred Jewish text about the story of the Exodus and freedom. We have medieval liturgical poems on Hanukkah. And we have sacred texts that are presented in life cycle events. Even the wedding document, the Ketubah, is written in Aramaic, which is the common language of the 1st and 2nd century, which the Talmud is written in, and other texts. And these sacred texts form the basis for meditation in our mystical tradition. So it's core part of who we are. And here's the problem. In the 21st century here, most of us don't have access, and we have a lot of distance from these core sacred texts of Jewish life. And that can happen for a number of reasons. One is that most of us do not have the facility of Hebrew. And Hebrew is so core to understanding Jewish texts because translation is always interpretation. Okay, translation is always interpretation. Words in Hebrew can have many, many different meanings and have certain cultural contexts. I'll give you an example. The word for tzedakah, which we know in our common English language as charity, right? Tzedakah is giving money or funds to help out people, organizations, situations in need. Now, the difference though is charity in English connects to the word caritas, the Latin, which means caring. And so charity is about we give because it's an expression of love and care for our fellow human. Tzedakah, while the action may be the same, is not really accurate to translate as charity because tzedakah comes from the Hebrew word tzedek, which means justice, righteousness. It means we don't give because it's an expression of love and it feels good. We give because it's a way of bringing justice in the world. It's a way of addressing inequality. We give whether we feel like it or not, whether it makes us feel good or not. We give because it's just the right thing to do. If we have extra to give, we want to share it. That's a very different meaning in the Hebrew. The same thing with earth versus human beings. You know, earth, the word for human in Hebrew is Adam. The word for earth is Adamah. Same root, earth, human being. There's already an understanding that from the language itself that we are connected and part of the earth. So whenever we read translations of the Hebrew, we're always getting interpretation. So it's always good to be able to understand where is the translation coming from? How was the translation done? Was there particular methods that were going on? And the more that we can be able to learn and understand even little bits of Hebrew, it begins to give us more access to the meaning of the text. Another piece of the Hebrew and understanding the text is gematria, which is that every Hebrew letter has a numerical value. So Hebrew words have numerical values. And a lot of the time, understanding text is understanding how similar words have similar values and how they're connected. So one problem we have with accessing Jewish texts is translation. Fortunately, the other piece is that before the Haskalah or the Enlightenment period in the 19th century, when kind of the birth of rationality and being able to think scientifically, before these things, all of these sacred texts that we're part of were things that Jews grew up with. They were part of a lot of, Bible, Torah, even, some Talmud and Midrash. These were part of people's Jewish lives. But with the Enlightenment and rationality and science, these texts were seen as religious and unmodern and really antithetical to the movement that Jews were trying to do to fit into the wider society, take places in universities. And so there was a pushing aside of a lot of that. And we feel the effect of that today. And then the other piece that really, I think, affected Jews' relationship to Jewish texts was Christian attitudes. And this was, even in the language of the Old Testament, the idea is that the Old Testament is old, right? And the New Testament is new. The New Testament, the teachings of Jesus, are the ones that are relevant, that are applicable. And, the Old Testament, which a lot about law and kind of ways of living, these weren't so relevant anymore. And, this kind of attitude of irrelevance of these older texts, whether that's coming from Christian attitudes or coming from Jews themselves from the Enlightenment, I think they've filtered in to us today. Any other questions or comments before we move on to the Talmud? Okay, I'm going to share the screen again. And I will add that within the Bible itself, we find lots of different forms of literature. It's really not one thing. We find narrative, juicy soap opera-y narrative, as we just read in our weekly portion about Jacob and Esau, fighting over the blessing of their father, and deception and trickery, and all of that, and dreams of ladders going from heaven to earth. So we have narrative, we have poetry, huge poems and songs are parts of the Torah and the Bible, and also law, law, guidance for living, and law. So all of those things are all part of the Torah. So now we come to the Talmud, and I think this piece right here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Midrash. Both of these sources come from Midrash, but the Song of Songs Rabbah and Avot de Rabbi Natan. But I think these say a good piece about the theory and thinking behind the creation of the Talmud and rabbinic writings. So they write, when the persecutions of Hadrian were over, our sages gathered at Usha, Rabbi Judah and Rabbi Nehemiah and Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai and Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Yosei the Galilean, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Jacob. And they sent a message to the elders of Galilee saying, let whoever has learned come and teach, and whoever has not learned, come and learn. And they gathered together, learned and taught, and did as the times required. So this is really speaking about the historical reality that gave birth to really gave birth to Judaism as we know it. And that piece is that after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the rabbis organized themselves to spread the teaching. And that's what this text is highlighting to. And really, what I think we can understand is that all the way from the time of Moses and the prophets and the people wandering in the desert in the biblical period, there has been orally traditions and teachings that have been passed down over hundreds of years. And even though the central focus of religious worship was always the temple in Jerusalem, the first temple that was destroyed in 586 BCE, and then the second temple in Jerusalem, which was destroyed in 70 CE, up until this time, there were many different ways of practicing Judaism, the central focus being temple worship and animal sacrifice. And there was a group of a sect of Jews, which we know as the Pharisees, who gathered and studied, but they also did something very innovative, which was they created ritual and worship that could take place in one's own home. So now, instead of the altar being just in the temple in Jerusalem where the animals were sacrificed, now the altar was also one's own dinner table. It was a mikdash me'at, a little sanctuary. And now one could express worship and gratitude to God through meals, through what was happening, what people did in their own home. And the Pharisees, or the rabbis, really kind of strove to have worship spread over every fabric of life, not just the temple and not just temple worship. And so they taught this idea that we shared earlier, that all of these teachings, these ways of interpretation, these practices that were being taught orally over hundreds and hundreds of years, and that these rabbis and their disciples were also coming up with, that these were actually given by Moses at Sinai. This was oral Torah. And the Pharisees really kind of set themselves up as the carriers of this tradition. And the Pharisees are what we really know as the early rabbis. So when the temple was destroyed, it became even stronger imperative that these teachings were organized and they were taught and they were able to be transmitted. And so this text right here from Avot de Rabbi Natan talks about Rabbi Akiva living in the 1st and 2nd century. It says he was like a worker who took his basket and went outside. He found wheat and put it in. He found barley and put it in. He found spelt and put it in. He found lentils and put them in. And when he came into his house, he set aside the wheat by itself, the barley by itself, and the beans by themselves. Rabbi Akiva did likewise and made the whole Torah into separate rings. And these separate rings, these organizing of all of these different teachings of how Torah can really be practiced in everyday life that was passed down by these rabbis, became the basis for what we know as the Mishnah. Okay, and the Mishnah was, let's see if I can find a particular document that I was wanting to share with you. Let me just give it a second. While I'm finding that, if anybody has any questions that you'd like to ask, please go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I haven't pieced this all together yet, but with my resources and stuff, but I just, the idea that there were some communities, Jewish communities that went out to kind of the fringes of the community or into the desert with various, spiritual practices, maybe ascetic practices, and kind of had an early model for what we now call monasticism. I'm interested in, I know this may not be, this is an overview and a survey, but if you could just briefly maybe mention that, or I could schedule an appointment and talk to you about it at a later time.
No, that's great. That's great, Levana. No, so at this time of when we're talking about 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, this period of about 200, 300 years, there were a lot of different sects of Judaism. And when we are talking about this class on Jewish texts, we're really talking about the sects that were what we know as the Pharisees. They were the ones that created the literature that we know as being Judaism. But at this time, there were many different sects, but another very popular one was called the Essenes. Right, and the Essenes were a monastic group. They had a monastic community down by the Dead Sea, and they had their own texts and practices. And really, they didn't, live. So much of what got created by the Pharisees was a Judaism that was very focused on family, and community, and theirs was not so much. It was really about individual, and that's part of why they didn't, one of the reasons why they didn't really continue much longer was because there wasn't so much repopulation. But a lot of what we know as from Maury's question about documents being dated and what kinds of, what were more authentic versions of different texts, we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you can find copies in the Jerusalem Museum and in other places, were archaeological findings that came from the Essenes. They were the Dead Sea Scrolls because they were these Dead Sea communities, and the Essenes studied a lot of these sacred texts that are earlier on in a monastic way. So yes, they were we know what we know about Jewish sacred texts so much because of the Essenes and those findings. But that particular sect of Judaism did not, last or perpetuate forward. And we don't actually have a whole lot of records because they didn't really write down so many of their own practices. They had scrolls that were for previous texts.
So a monastic community or a monastic lifestyle or practice would, in modern times, not be considered as part of the Jewish fold?
Well, again, we can look at it and see that as far as the people of Israel, this was this monastic way and monastic life was a very authentic stream of how our people related to Torah and to God. Now the question is what do we know what is Judaism actually? That becomes, more reflected through that upside down pyramid, bringing to the Talmud and Midrash, because we don't have, it was really these early rabbis that began to create the religion that we know as Judaism. In the same way that another one of the early Israelite sects were the early Christians. So, right, the early Christians, people who lived in the first century, were practicing Israelites who practiced the Judaism of that time, and their teacher was Jesus of Nazareth. And Rabbi Jesus was a rabbi just like the other rabbis that we find in the Talmud. Rabbi Eliezer, who had schools and thoughts, and they followed his teachings just like other Jews followed other teachings. And the difference was that this sect eventually broke away from Judaism in not so much even really from their belief that Jesus was the Messiah, because at that time in the first century, what Messiah meant was the person who was going to liberate the Jewish people from oppression from foreign rulers. It was not some kind of supernatural son of God that got developed in later times. So their belief in Jesus being the Messiah in the definition that I just gave was still very much a Jewish belief. It was still within the fold of Judaism. There were a lot of other rabbis at that time that disagreed with them, that didn't think that Jesus was the Messiah. But even the great Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba, who led the revolt against the Romans, in the second century, thought that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah in that way. And Rabbi Akiva doesn't get more at the heart of Jewish tradition. So, all of that it wasn't really until 100 years later, 80 years later, with Paul, originally Saul and Paul, that Christianity, that early sect of Jews became Christians, when Paul really created a whole new relationship to the sacred texts and to what Jesus meant. But at the time, the Essenes and the early Christians were both different sects and practitioners of the people of Israel and of Judaism of that time. It just didn't last. Just like, the early Christians turned into something else, the Essenes didn't last.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna, any other questions before we move on to the Talmud? Okay, so.
Wait, no, I have a question. Sorry, I couldn't unmute fast
Go
enough.
ahead. That's fine.
So I had a question in regards to, like when Jesus died and stuff and he came back and Christians believe he was the Messiah. I know a few Christians who believe when he came back as a Christian. He was no longer like considered Jewish. And I feel like that's an argument I always get in with people. So like, what is your take on that?
So first of all, that scope is really more for a class on Christianity, because that is completely within the tradition of Christian tradition and how they understand their relationship to God through Jesus. It's really not a relevant question to Judaism. Judaism has really nothing particular to say about it. But what I will say is, let's see, I got a little message here. Couple different resources that's good to understand this. One is, there's a wonderful book by a Hebrew University scholar called From Jesus to Paul. And it really kind of traces a lot of the development of Judaism and the early Christians into Christianity. It's a great book to understand that from a Jewish perspective, what happened historically in that. And got another recommendation in the chat, which is one called Revolution in Judea by Chaim Maccoby. So want to recommend that. And Amanda, you and I can talk more about that in future talks.
Okay.
We'll keep with Jewish texts right now. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. Let's see if I can find this. Let's see here. Let's see it. Let's see. I don't think this is it. There's nothing so far showing up, right? Oh, this is preview. Okay, here we go. All right, let me see what you're, okay. What are you seeing right now? Is this the 8 nights? Is this the wrong one? Let me try this again. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right, so we talked about Rabbi Akiva organizing a lot of this oral Torah in different ways. And and essentially this is what we know as the Mishnah. And the Mishnah has 6, it's called 6 orders or 6 sidarim. One section here is called Zra'im, which is really about the agricultural laws, with the exception of this number 1, which is called brachot, which is benedictions, which is all the laws that we know about prayer. It's very interesting that they ordered prayer as one of the sections that goes under agricultural laws, or zera'im, which means seeds, because prayer is kind of conceived of here as seeds that we plant. There's also a whole nother order called moed, which is laws around festivals and sacred times. Nashim, women. We have to remember that this was a male enterprise, this rabbinic enterprise at this time of 1st, 2nd century. And so these are things around marriage contracts and divorce, vows. Then we have a whole order called nizikin, which is civil law, damages, property law, courts, all of those things. We have things about business here. Kodashim, sacrifices. Again, these are laws that really only apply to the temple in Jerusalem. But even though the Mishnah was created after the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, there was still hope that it would be rebuilt at some point. And so they really kept along the dialogue of these laws. And then toharot, which are purities, this whole sense of how one becomes spiritually pure, how we can become spiritually impure. There's a whole very fascinating section of that in the Mishnah. So, one of the things about this is that the Mishnah, it's composed in a very terse language. It's arranged topic by topic over a wide range of subjects. And it looks like a code of Jewish law. But it's full of a lot of unresolved legal disputes. It's liberally sprinkled with non-legal materials, stories, scriptural interpretations, etc. seems like it's an early attempt to reduce the oral Torah to an official compilation, to kind of provide some kind of authoritative statement of the minimal amount of learning that a disciple had to acquire for admittance into an advanced rank in the rabbinic movement of the time of these circles. And by 3rd century, the Mishnah had become the central text of the oral Torah, discussed by groups of rabbis and their disciples, forming perspectives and traditions of how to interpret. And this rapidly expanding mass of interpretation and discussion of the Mishnah, of these 6 orders that we're looking at here, became an object in its own right of study called the Talmud, or the Gemara, the Talmud in Hebrew, Gemara in Aramaic. But so that really what we have is the Mishnah, this short code, and then all of the rabbis' discussions and arguments and everything on those topics in the Mishnah. So if you look at a piece of, let me just see, if you look at a piece of Talmud, let me just find it. It's going to look something like this. The colors are not, you won't find a page of Talmud with the colors, but I find this to just be a good way to separate the different texts. So on a page of Talmud, this is all in Aramaic that we study even to this day. This, where I've got my cursor here, this salmon color is the Mishnah in the center here. So this is, from what time do we say the Shema prayer in the morning? And there's a little bit about this. Then this, if you follow it down to this more beigey section or yellowy section, I'm not sure. This right here is the Gemara, or the rabbis' discussions, arguments about the Mishnah. So it's like they start talking about, and when you start to study a page of Talmud, you start to look at not just the Mishnah itself, but what did the rabbis think about it and what was their different perspectives on it. Then you have on this page of Talmud 2 different sections. This whole blue piece is the medieval commentator Rashi, and we're going to explore who Rashi is in just a little bit, but this is a 11th, 12th century rabbi who has a lot to say about how to understand the Talmud. Because again, even this is a 3rd, 4th century text here. And so now even in the 11th century, hundreds of years later, Jews had to know, how do you understand what's meant by the Talmud 600 or 700 years before? So Rashi helps with that. And then on the right side here, you have Rashi's disciples, known as the Tosafot, other perspectives and unique perspectives on the Talmud itself. And then other commentators on these sides here, different editions of the Talmud have different choices of who they put on the sides or the edges of the page. But the idea is that studying Talmud is about really looking at a lot of different voices that are interacting on the page. Now, in the Talmud, there is a lot of there's what we call halakha, which is Jewish law. How are things done? How are holidays observed? How are prayers done? What do you do if you find a lost object? How do you interact? What do you do if there's a situation in business you need to talk about? And so there's halakha, but then there's also something called agadah. And agadah is stories and interpretations of text and scripture. And this right here, a good way to talk about what interpretation means is midrash. And midrash is really core here, core piece that I wanna talk about. But just want to check, are people with me still? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, we're with you.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So this comes back to something that Amanda or Anne asked earlier. I don't know who it was, but one of the things that is really unique about Jewish text is this idea of midrash, this idea that there is not one interpretation of sacred scripture, that when we look at the 5 books of Moses or the Hebrew Bible, midrash is the rabbi's understanding that there are infinite ways to interpret a single verse and to understand a single verse. And so interpretation and various interpretations to teach different things are very much encouraged in Jewish thought and practice and life. So there are even huge other, besides midrash or interpretations that appear in the Talmud, what we're looking at right now, there are huge books of compilations of these interpretations that is called the classical midrash. So you can see in some of the classical compilations, one called Midrash Rabbah, the Great Midrash. You'll have the book of Genesis, and it will go, line by line or verse by verse in the book of Genesis, or sections of verses. And then there will be a whole bunch of interpretations about what those verses could mean. Or there could be rabbis' commentary about what parts of the story or the narrative, what are the blanks that need to be filled in, what's not told, and what do they chose to fill in to offer a greater sense of scope of the story. These collections and this encouragement of many different interpretations is a core part of Judaism. So when we talk about Christianity and understanding, what is the place of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible in Christianity? Well, so much of the proof for the coming of Jesus and the place of Jesus really comes from interpretations, certain interpretations of Scripture. How do you interpret the book of Isaiah when it says that, that a light is going to be born, or a star from the east? Do you interpret that poetically, as a lot of the rabbis did, to refer to certain things? Or do you interpret it literally as referring to the person that we know as Jesus? And so on one hand, from a perspective of Jewish tradition, interpreting these texts to be talking about the validity of Jesus as the Messiah, that is a valid midrash. That is a valid midrash, because Jewish text and tradition affirms many, many different ways of looking at the text. And so it's valid to say that there was a group of Jews that could say, the text means this. The Haggadah on Passover means this. However, to go ahead and say that it means only this, that goes against the tradition of Midrash, which says that there can be many different interpretations. As soon as I lock down on one and take that literally and say that that is the way, I have left the scope of Judaism as we know it, which Jewish text is one that is able to hold multiple and paradoxical interpretations and midrashim. Questions, comments about that? About Talmud, Mishnah, or Midrash?
I wanted to just quickly about midrash.
Yeah.
What are the parameters of midrash for kind of the regulations for modern day I'm looking at like, feminist interpretation of creating midrash. What are the parameters? And maybe this goes beyond the extent of the survey presentation. I understand.
Oh,
Just
no.
the, okay.
Great question, Lavana, great question. So when we talk about midrash, um, we're also, there are different periods of midrash. So there's a period of midrash called what we call the classical midrash, and this kind of took place between probably 400 and 1200 CE. And these are a lot of the famous midrashic collections: Midrash Rabbah, Pesikta de Rav Kahana, Midrash Tanchuma, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. These are these collections of midrash that we know as classical, and there are interpretive principles that the rabbis have outlined that need to be applied in order for midrash to exist. There are things like where when you see two different words that might be used in two different contexts but have the same word, how do you draw an interpretation from that? So there's kind of like these rules that govern the classical and traditional midrash that, and it's part of, there was, when you start to study the rules of interpretation of midrash, it's fascinating because you see that there's a lot of wisdom in trying to develop new, creative, innovative interpretations, but ones that are bound by certain rules so that one stays really connected to what has come before at the same time that one is creating something new. So that it's almost like in any new midrashic idea, you can recognize kind of a Jewish tom or taste because it reflects previous Jewish texts. However, midrash as a word doesn't only, and as far as our tradition goes, even though the rabbis created these rules for classical midrash, it also, the word midrash, or from the word lidrosh, meaning to seek, goes beyond those rules of interpretation. And we find in medieval times, after 1200, especially with the development of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, that the Kabbalists threw these rules out the window. They were incredibly innovative, creative, and radical in how they interpreted scripture and brought those pieces in. And they kind of opened up a whole kind of a opening within the Jewish textual tradition at that time to be more free with interpretation and with midrash. So, I would say that, now, again, when you talk about new modern midrashim, modern interpretations, feminists, others, all of it is on the table as valid midrash. Now, we're going to have different communities within the Jewish people that might have different thoughts and feelings about that. Certainly the Orthodox community is going to be much more limited in what they're going to accept as being midrash. If it's not traditional midrash, there's going to be span of what's acceptable and what's not, and most likely it's going to really only refer to men. Certainly there are some modern Orthodox ultra religious teachers that are now welcoming in more women learners and teachers, but for the most part that's not there. But if you look at the more liberal forms of Judaism, conservative, reform, renewal, and reconstructionists, you'll find lots of room and affirmation for all kinds of midrash and interpretation. Okay, any other questions? Talmud, Midrash, Mishnah, before we move on to the medieval period.
So going back to what you said a second ago, Heather, sorry.
Yeah.
what you said a minute ago. So are you saying that the Zohar is sort of, it's also midrash, or it's?
Yes, yes, and we'll get there. We're coming to the medieval, so we're gonna go right to Kabbalah and Zohar. Anything else? Okay, let's do it. All right, so let's go to the medieval Bible commentaries. So where there have been these collections of different midrashim throughout time, one of the things that has started to become a big part of Jewish texts was some of these very great rabbis and popular commentators who became part of traditional Jewish study of the Torah, of scripture, of Bible, because they synthesized so much of Jewish tradition into their interpretations. So if you couldn't spend all the time reading volumes of collections of midrashim, you could study the medieval Bible commentators. And what you're looking at right now is a page called the Mikraot Gedulot. And what you have here, the Mikraot Gedulot, is a book of, let's say, of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, where you have the text of the Torah here in big in the right corner. You have in the left here, Onkelos, which is the Aramaic translation. That was the translation of the time of the people. It's kind of like having an English, your English side by side with your Hebrew on the right here, explaining what it is. But what's interesting is that the Aramaic is closer to a lot of the thinking, the Aramaic translation, a lot of the thinking of the 1st and 2nd century rabbis. So if you look at Onkelos's translation, you can have insight into how were the rabbis of that time viewing the text by how Onkelos translated it. Then you have Rashi's commentary here in the second level of the left side. And Rashi was Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, 12th century, 11th century France. And Rashi is the great commentator to study with the Torah, because what he does, he doesn't really offer any original interpretation of his own. He more gathers and synthesizes earlier midrashim, 2nd century, 3rd century, that have things to say about the text, some of the most popular midrashim, most popular interpretations. So by reading Rashi, it's kind of like a greatest hits of the midrash on that particular verse in the Torah. You don't want to spend the time listening to all the albums of a particular artist. You want to get the greatest hits. So study Rashi, you'll get the greatest hits. Other commentators that's worth looking at Rashbam, who's Rashi's grandson, Shmuel ben Meir, also France. Rashbam is so intense on the grammar, on understanding the grammar correctly of the Torah. So you study Rashbam, and you start to also, and Ibn Ezra as well, Spain, 2nd century, also grammar, but also like really interested in the understanding the literal Peshat meaning of the text in the way that it was maybe put forth in context, and trying to bring in historical knowledge that they knew at the time, grammatical knowledge, that kind of thing. And then you have the Ramban, or Nachmanides, which is on the bottom here. And Nachmanides was a mystic. He was really bringing insights from early Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism into the understanding of the Torah itself. So you'll find things in the Ramban about angels. So when we learn in Parshat Vayera about Abraham sitting at the opening of his tent and 3 strangers greeted him, and who were these 3 strangers? Were the angels? The Ramban's commentary gets into angelology. What are angels? Who are angels? What are these messengers that we're talking about? And usually Ramban's commentary is long. In rabbinical school, whenever we had to prepare a page of Mikraot Gedolot, which was to kind of go through the text and translate, each one of these different commentators, in some sense, part of us would dread Nachmanides. I mean, I always liked Nachmanides, the Ramban, because it had Jewish mysticism in it, and I was interested in that stuff. But it was also it took the longest time to translate because it was the long periods of text. So these were some of the famous commentators at that time. Any questions or comments on these commentators? Okay, so let's talk for a moment about Kabbalah. And I don't really have graphic here. I'm gonna stop the share for a moment. We'll start again. But Kabbalah is, and you asked a very appropriate question, Heather, which is Kabbalah, or is the Zohar midrash or interpretation on the Torah? And it is. But what I want to say first about Kabbalah, the word Kabbalah means receiving. And this really refers to the mystical strain in Judaism, which has really existed all the way from the biblical period. We have periods of talking about Isaac meditating in the field. There are kind of visionary, mystical visions of Ezekiel and the book of Daniel. But we have in the 1st and 2nd century, we find in the Talmud something called Hechalot mysticism, which was the workings of the chariot, certain meditative practices that one could do. But we see mysticism really flower in the 12th and 13th century. And to say what we mean by mysticism and mystics is, mystics seek a intimate knowledge of God, of the divine, that goes beyond intellectualization and rational thinking. And it's not that mystics were anti-intellect, not at all, but they just really saw that experience of doing mitzvot and Torah study was not something that just, one didn't come close to God just through intellect alone, but also through other kinds of practices. So they tend to find in themselves something in common with God, with the divine, these divine qualities that some of us know of as the Sefirot, qualities of loving kindness, of boundary, things that these divine energies that shape the cosmos that are articulated in the book of the Zohar. These are energies that are found in each of us as being part of creation. For mystics, nature was always an opportunity for discovering the sacred. And mystics, really, there was a real involved of a disciplined way of life, that engaging in mitzvot and traditional Jewish practice was something that was about repairing the world. Was some of the early phrases of tikkun olam, repairing the world, wasn't from these ideas that we think about now of social justice. They came from the sense that that all of our actions have ripples on the cosmic fabric of the world. We think that we have thoughts or we do things and it doesn't affect anybody, but for mystics, it has effects beyond what we can know. And so by engaging in study and prayer and mitzvot, we actually are helping repair and bring whole the entire universe. And mystics had various techniques of meditation and prayer. And so some of the core books of sacred texts of the Kabbalah was first the Sefer HaBahir, or the Book of Illumination, 1150, so that this was about 1150 to 1200. That was originated in Provence, southern France. The Zohar started in Spain. And the Zohar, kind of the big book of Kabbalah, was really is organized by the books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, and so on, and really takes a verse of the Torah and offers midrash interpretation. And these midrashim interpretations can take the form of stories and journeys of the early rabbis, Shimon Bar Yochai and his chevra, his disciples and students, and really were these mystical interpretations of the Torah. How do the verses of the Torah, how do we interpret them in ways that help bring us closer to God in an experiential way? That was the interest of the Kabbalah and the Zohar. And how do we understand the Torah to be a blueprint or a map of the universe? How do we understand the cosmology and the metaphysics of the universe through the Torah? The Zohar was the book of that. The Kabbalah continued to develop. Another incredibly creative renaissance of Kabbalah was when the expulsion of Spain and the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, a great number of Spanish Jews fled to northern Israel, to the city of Sfat in northern Israel, and established a sacred community there. And in Sfat, with the leadership of Rabbi Isaac Luria, Moses Cordovero, and Yosef Karo, they created this Jewish community based and founded on mystical practices that were found in the Zohar, but also created their own kind of cosmology and sense of mysticism that built on not only the Zohar, but previous midrashim. And so if you study the work of the Zohar or the work of these Sfat Kabbalists, you'll see, just like that upside down pyramid, that you find these different layers, first of Zohar, then of Midrash, and of Talmud, and all of those things. So one really only starts to really understand Kabbalah when you understand those other references of Jewish texts and where they come from. Any questions about Kabbalah and this kind of aspect of medieval Jewish texts?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the Friday night service. That's all Kabbalah, isn't it? The Friday night service, the practices of the Kabbalah,
Yes.
the Kabbalists became the Friday night service of conservative Judaism.
It became the Friday night service of all Judaism. So what you're bringing up is really important, Neil. So one of the innovations that happened among these mystics in 16th century Sfat was they created a whole new prayer service. This whole new prayer, up until this time, on Friday nights in the greeting of Shabbat, there was an evening service, just like there was an evening service for every other night, with the exception that they would do a special psalm for Shabbat, Psalm 92 and Psalm 93, and they would light candles and greet Shabbat like they always did. But as part of the mysticism that was arising in northern Israel, they had this practice of going out into the fields, nature, and being out. And all of us know this, so it doesn't seem like such a great, innovation. But at that time, to have this religious practice be about being in nature and the sun going down and feeling the coming on of the presence of Shabbat and the sacred time was really powerful and special for them. And they created new prayers and new songs, the most famous from Shlomo Alkabetz being Lecha Dodi. And then in addition to Lecha Dodi, said, we're going to bring these psalms that we know from the book of Psalms, Psalm 95 through 99, and we're going to recite these psalms and sing, and maybe we'll even recite some of the verses from, or even the entire book of the Song of Songs, the love song between God and the people of Israel, and greet Shabbat. And this became this new service called Kabbalat Shabbat, and has been part of Jewish communities all over since the 16th century, not just conservative, Orthodox, Reform, all of it, of this welcoming of Shabbat. So that's a great example of how mysticism Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah has really affected our everyday mainstream Jewish prayer life. Okay, let me do a screen share again. So the other piece that we need to look at before we leave the medieval period is the Jewish philosophical tradition. And this, one of the things that's really important to realize about Jewish tradition and these Jewish sacred texts is that we've been influenced so much by the cultures and the traditions that we're a part of. And, even Kabbalah, which I'm going to, but Jewish philosophical tradition specifically really arose within these different philosophic traditions that were becoming very popular at the time. So in the 10th century, in the Eastern Muslim Empire, there was a philosophic school called Kalam. And again, this was a rise of philosophy that had certain rules and understandings and ways. And at one point, I knew more about Kalam itself when I was studying it in school, but can't really tell you that now. But what I can tell you about it is Saadia Gaon, who came out of that school and brought this kind of the philosophical thinking of the Kalam into Judaism. His book of beliefs and opinions was pretty radical in that there was a real battle at this time through a sect called the Karaites. And this was a sect of Jews who really battled against the rabbinic enterprise of Talmud and Midrash that we've talked about. The Karaites were ones that only took the authority of the written Torah or of the Bible itself, and they took this literally. And this is really interesting piece because I think it connects in with Lavana's question before about the Essenes and, kind of what are within the people of Israel, what becomes in the circle of what's considered Judaism and out of the circle of, where are the boundaries? Where are the boundaries? There were boundaries that were set in regards to Jesus and the development of Christianity. And one of the other big boundaries that was set was among the Karaites, Karaism, which was a real rejection of everything all of the ways that the rabbis interpreted this idea that there was oral Torah at the same time as written Torah, and to really understand the written Torah literally. And the problem with that, obviously is, there's a lot of stuff in the written Torah that's pretty darn ugly. People getting stoned for breaking Shabbat, for carrying things on Shabbat. Somebody talks back to their parents and they're put to death. Things that were part of whether you want to say that was part of the fabric of biblical time, whether that was a literary device to teach a certain thing and not meant to be taken literally. The rabbinic tradition really interpreted those verses in ways that brought their values forward that sometimes completely contradicted what was literally said in the Torah. But the Karaites took it literally, everything, and so that was a piece that was really important for Jewish communities at that time to address. And Saadia Gaon was crucial in that because he was really one of the first people to apply that human reason, that the philosophical process of applying human reason to problems was a way that we could understand the Torah and come closer to truth. And it was a way of affirming that the rabbi's interpretive process was a way of engaging reason, was a way of engaging good sense, and did not have to take literally everything that was in the Bible or the scripture. And so Saadia Gaon was a major force of beginning to start to bring that argument of reason into understanding scripture. In the 11th century, in the Western Muslim Empire, there was Neoplatonism. And there were Solomon ibn Gabriel, Bachya ibn Pakuda, Judah Halevi. This was 11th, 12th century. These were some of the major, works of this. And, in the 11th century, Muslim Spain broke off from the Abbasid dynasty and established their own independent caliphate under Abd al-Rahman III. And what was great about this was, at that time, Abu al-Rahman III was really open to Jews and to a certain kind of religious pluralism of the time. And one of the Jews, Hasteh ibn Shaprut, was an advisor to this Muslim ruler. And as a result, Jewish writing and teaching could really flourish in Muslim Spain at this time. And there was this incredible interchange between Muslims and Jews in this 11th, 12th century Western Muslim empire, especially between Muslim Sufis, the mystical sect of Islam, and Jews. And Solomon ibn Gabriel, Bachya ibn Pakuda, we see in their texts so much of these Neoplatonic and Islamic principles and ways of thinking that are focused on character development, are focused on coming close to God, talking about the nature of the soul. And this is even some of Bachya ibn Pakuda's duties of the heart could even be talked about as one of the foundational Musar texts in our tradition, which is a whole nother stream of texts about inner character development and how we kind of refine our own qualities. The other, of course, most famous contribution from the Jewish philosophic tradition was the Rambam, or Moses Maimonides, in the 12th century. And he was really focused on integrating the teachings of Aristotle, which many of Jews of that time in Egypt and Spain were really engrossed in. How do we take this new and very powerful way of thinking about and looking at the world and integrate it with this anthropomorphic Torah that we have that seems to fly in the face of all of that? And Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, or Moreh Nevuchim, was really this attempt to really understand the Torah through philosophical principles, and is an incredible, amazing text to study. Any questions about Jewish philosophy, or anything that we're talking about here? Okay. So let me stop this share. So the last piece that I just want to touch on really briefly is Chassidut and modern Jewish texts. And Chassidut was an incredible revolutionary movement in the 18th century, starting with the founder of the early Hasidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov was, essential message was that every Jew, every person, no matter whether they have a lot of learning or little learning, could come close to God in a very experiential way, and could come close to God in everything, in family, in business, and all of those things, where there was always an understanding from early Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, that everything is in the scope of serving God, that through doing mitzvot, through observing oral Torah, and how we, in all facets of life, we're doing God's will. The sense in Chassidut was one could actually have an experiential opening to God through every aspect of life, interpersonally, through everything that we do. And he was, and the Hasidic movement and all of his disciples and everything that unfolded over the next couple hundred years were essentially taking Kabbalah, the mystical tradition, and making it very accessible to a person that didn't, at that time, that did not have very much learning. So if at that time before, if you wanted to engage the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, which was concerned with mystical experience of God, one had to be incredibly learned and having all these references and understandings of all the texts that came before. Chassidut, at this time, came forth and brought forward these principles in more accessible ways, where you did not have to have all that previous learning, making it accessible to the modern person. So that's a lot of the power of the early Hasidic movement. It democratized Judaism and spiritual experience in a way that had never happened before. And those, I'll say, in following that stream, we now have a whole stream that we could call neo-Hasidic, which is the sense of being able to take a lot of those teachings, spiritual teachings, out of their orthodox contexts, meaning that one could study and practice those teachings without having to be part of an ultra-religious community, and bring it into our modern values of pluralism and egalitarianism, and diversity, and be able to explore those teachings from that place in our modern world. And really, that I think is really the striving of a lot of modern Jewish texts today, whether you're talking about modern Jewish theology of Martin Buber and Abraham Joshua Heschel and Judith Plaskow and Arthur Green and all of all the various feminist teachers and rabbis, all the way up into this day and age, Rabbi Brad Artson from Orange County. So all of that is really about saying, how do we understand our Jewish tradition within our modern world with the modern values that we have, and try to apply these. So any other questions, comments? That's the end, really, kind of the survey of what I have prepared. This is a good time for any questions before we close.
Rabbi, I joined late because I was at the prayer service. You referred to the upside down pyramid. I just wanted to make certain that I understood that.
Okay, did you want to see it? Okay, let me share it again.
Just real quickly.
Yeah, real quick. And I can, because it's my writing, I can spell out what it is. So it's really showing that that Jewish text really fans out from the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, in this upside down pyramid. So, we have the Bible as our sacred text, but really Judaism, as we know it, as it's formulated, the foundational building blocks, really comes through this next layer of Talmud and Midrash. That idea of Midrash, that there can be many, many interpretations, the idea of Talmud, of how Judaism is viewed by all the different schools of thought at that time, and how those different schools are in dialogue with each other on the page. The later developments of law codes, poetry, Kabbalah, philosophy, in the medieval period of time, these flourishings of lots of different thoughts here. And then Chassidut. Again, I'm not, the fact that Chassidut is bigger here isn't to say that there's anything bigger than it than any of these other categories. It's just to fit the length of that part of the pyramid. And then, modern right here.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
Kind of a quick, I'll try to make it quick. Going on, what you were saying about Kabbalah and you have to be extremely learned, reference all of these texts. Two things are coming to me about this. One is, again, kind of, you know, eking my way back to the whole cultural appropriation thing. We see a lot of references to Kabbalah nowadays that kind of had an asexual budding formation out of the Jewish tradition. And we see it in kind of a particularly Christian kind of occult tradition, which is fascinating. But I just wanted to make that distinction that I've encountered a lot of people that are very confused about interpretations that are coming from Kabbalah in a non-Jewish context and a Jewish context. And then kind of sidelining that, what you just brought up with the Hasidic tradition and bringing some of these mystic, Kabbalistic understandings down to the modern everyday person who may not have access to text references and all the learning, or even perhaps even the Hebrew language. Is that still defined within the parameters of one can study these, but in the context of community, particularly Jewish community? So it's not so much I can go off to myself and with my books in my ladder and have my little monastic mystical Jewish studies, but I have to be embedded within community, or I know there's two different points, but I just kind of wanted to put it out there to kind of ask how far, again, it is within certain parameters that we have access to these teachings. And I was just wondering if you could clarify or
Yeah.
develop my thought further. Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. I think there's two different pieces there to address. One is that absolutely our tradition teaches us that we are meant to understand and learn Torah in community. That so much of what it means to come closer to, I'll say, truth, can only happen in relationship with each other. We need people to be able to bounce things off of, to study off of, and then, to also take your point. That's one aspect. The other aspect is to be able to study with a teacher, somebody who is able to provide the context, because, as you're referring to this whole non-Jewish development of Kabbalah, I think, you probably know more about it than I do, Levana, but, maybe starting in the 17th century, 18th century, maybe, with certain magic circles and other things. These are, a lot of the times you'll see this Kabbalah spelled with a Q, or others that, these may be really helpful and useful articulations of certain systems of spirituality that have been brought forth. But when they're not brought forth in the context of Jewish tradition, they become something else completely. I think it's really important to be able to distinguish that these kind of not Jewish forms of Kabbalah are not Kabbalah as we know it, but they may be influenced by Kabbalah, but have taken their own flavor and direction of the communities that have, adopted it. And this, I think, goes back to that earlier question that came down to, around, appropriation of Jewish text, cultural appropriation. And I think, it doesn't show a whole lot of responsibility or integrity for Kabbalah to be adapted in this way that's not within the Jewish community or Jewish learning or texts of that, and still call it Kabbalah, as opposed to calling it something else, or being able to say this is inspired by Kabbalah, or being able to kind of represent accurately what it is that you're putting forward. Because it's not to say that those Christian forms or non-Jewish forms of Kabbalah may have great value, but let's be clear about what it is that we're learning or studying. I'll just, before we close too, I want to, for those who are really interested in kind of some of that early Jewish Christian development, Levana put in the chat a great resource. Amy Jill Levine is an incredible professor at Vanderbilt Divinity School who I always love to learn from. She's not Jewish, but she is an incredible scholar of this time. And you can find actually a lot of her talks on the Community Scholars Program archives. If you go ahead and Google Community Scholar Program, Orange County Community Scholar Program, and then on their website, try to find wherever their archives are and look up Amy Jill Levine. You can probably find some talks by her that are fascinating. Okay, well, thank you everybody for your attention and presence. I'm going to stop the recording here.